The serious night, the most dangerous of my life, started with a single stupid decision. I've never been an outdoors person. The very concept of sleeping on the ground, surrounded by bugs and the unsettling quiet of the wilderness, felt less like a vacation and more like a form of torture. But my father, a man who genuinely believed a person's character was built by confronting raw nature, was a fanatic for our annual camping expeditions. This particular summer, however, I had managed to negotiate a single concession. I'd finally persuaded him to let me bring my best friend Leo. Leo was my polar opposite, an Eagle Scout who could start a fire with 2 sticks in a determined glare. He saw my invitation as a perfect escape from his own chaotic family situation, so he agreed without a second thought. Our strategy was straightforward: endure the boredom as a team, mock the entire endeavor, and make it back to civilization in one piece. We were completely unaware that our simple strategy was on the verge of a catastrophic failure. The first indication that things were off came the moment we arrived. My dad's buddy had handled the reservations, and instead of the isolated, pristine forest we'd been promised, we drove into a place that resembled a suburban park with tent spots. There were concrete walkways, a brightly colored plastic playground, and the constant muffled sounds of other families. My father was livid. Leo just kept repeating under his breath, "This isn't authentic camping," a comment that quickly began to wear on my last nerve. But the true jaw-dropping surprise was waiting just beyond the tree line. A sprawling amusement park stood adjacent to our campsite, its skeletal roller coaster tracks clawing at the evening sky. It was a surreal, dissonant sight. The adults complained amongst themselves, but we were hours from home with no other options. After a tense and quiet meal, Leo and I escaped to the sanctuary of our tent. That's when he revealed the small, metallic container. We were at that stage in life where circumventing minor rules felt like a monumental achievement. He'd smuggled in a pipe and a little cannabis. We crept into the woods to partake, giggling at our own perceived cleverness. The altered state made the bizarre reality of our situation even more intense. Back inside the tent, buzzing with a restless, nervous energy, Leo shot me a glance I recognized immediately. It was the specific look that always came right before a profoundly bad, yet incredibly appealing idea. He proposed we go investigate the amusement park, not during its operating hours, but right now, long after midnight, when it was deserted and locked up. The adrenaline hit me instantly. The thought of scaling an immobile roller coaster, it felt like the perfect act of defiance against our monotonous, controlled weekend. We waited until the entire campsite was fast asleep, grabbed our flashlights, and made our move. The perimeter fence was no real obstacle. A quick lift from Leo, and I was over, then I returned the favor. We were inside the kingdom of silent rides and shuttered concession stands. We moved with the stealth of commandos, pressing ourselves against building walls whenever the electric hum of a security golf cart drew near. My heart was a frantic drum against my chest. The entire experience was equally terrifying and electrifying. We finally reached the foundation of the largest coaster. The metal ladder appeared to climb endlessly into the blackness above. We began our ascent. The metal was chilling to the touch, and every footstep seemed to create a deafening clang in the profound silence. A long section had no safety rails, and the ground below transformed into a distant, abstract painting. But we persevered and reached the summit. The vista from the top was absolutely staggering. We could observe the entire slumbering park, an intricate map of miniature lights spread out beneath us. We snapped one hurried, grainy picture, far too scared to activate the flash. The descent felt significantly more perilous than the climb upward. We were nearly back to the fence, our confidence growing that we'd pulled off the perfect caper, when we were forced to take cover from another patrol vehicle. We squeezed behind a large popcorn machine, holding our breath. And that's when I noticed it. A flicker of motion in the deep gloom between 2 maintenance sheds. I initially dismissed it as a trick of my mind, but then Leo elbowed me sharply, his face pale. He had seen it too. Roughly 30 feet away, another individual was hunched down in the shadows, concealing themselves just as we were. But this wasn't some other adventurous teenager. The figure was motionless, and a deep, instinctive part of me knew it was watching us directly. We were paralyzed, pinned down by the passing security and this new, unidentified danger. Then the shape shifted. It sprinted across a narrow beam of light cast by an overhead lamp. For one single heart-stopping moment, his face was perfectly illuminated. He was a man, his clothing ripped and soiled. His face was marred with streaks of a dark, viscous substance that my brain instantly and horrifyingly identified as blood. Leo and I swapped a single petrified look. No words were necessary. The guard finally moved on, and we scrambled for the fence, refusing to glance backward. We didn't utter a single syllable until we were safely zipped inside our tent, lying in our bags in the dark, trying to rationalize what we had witnessed. We eventually settled on the least frightening explanation: a homeless individual, perhaps suffering from a mental break. It was a flimsy theory, but it was the only one we could mentally accept. The next morning, a camp employee made a public announcement that turned the blood in our veins to ice. A man had been fatally stabbed at a lake several miles away the night before. The suspect was still at large, described as a disheveled male, possibly without a shirt and likely stained with blood. The official instructions were to immediately pack your belongings and evacuate the area. Leo and I locked eyes across the campfire. We knew with absolute certainty we had been within a few yards of a killer. Our quest for a cheap thrill nearly ended our lives. We never spoke up. In that moment, the sheer terror of facing consequences for our trespassing felt infinitely greater than the abstract concept of civic duty. It's a choice that has weighed on my conscience ever since. I sometimes lie awake and wonder if our cowardice allowed him to vanish and harm another person. We were fortunate. We escaped the park and we escaped his notice. But the image of his blood-smeared face in that fleeting moment of illumination is permanently burned into my memory.
But that wasn't the only time a normal day turned into a fight for survival. This next story takes place a few years later, during that bizarre period when creepy clowns were suddenly appearing everywhere. Most of it was just online hysteria, people seeking their 5 minutes of fame. But what happened to me was terrifyingly, undeniably real. I was 17, a junior in high school, riding the subway home after a long day of classes. The train car was unusually empty, which was a bit odd but not completely unheard of for that time of afternoon. I was completely tuned out, lost in my own world. I had my headphones on, music blasting, probably something by The Weeknd. To make matters worse, I was staring at my phone, reviewing flashcards for a biology test. I was about as aware of my surroundings as a rock. A terrible habit when traveling alone, but I'd made this trip 100 times and felt a false sense of security. My plan was to get off at the 96th Street station and walk the few blocks home. A standard, boring Tuesday. But the ordinary was about to shatter. The train pulled into the station and I stood up on autopilot, my body carrying out the routine without any conscious thought. With my gaze still fixed on my phone and music still drowning out the world, I shuffled toward the sliding doors. But as they hissed open, my peripheral vision registered something blocking the exit. I looked up and my brain short-circuited. A man had planted himself directly in the doorway. Only it wasn't just a man, it was a clown. He was in full garish costume, oversized multicolored trousers, a billowy yellow shirt with bright red suspenders, enormous floppy shoes, and that grotesque, exaggerated white makeup coating his face. A red ball nose, stark blue eyebrows, a complete cartoonish nightmare. The only thing missing was a colorful wig. I was literally frozen solid by the shock of seeing him. Not only was I totally unprepared, but I had never been that close to something so profoundly unsettling. He didn't speak, he just stood there, not attempting to board the train, but very clearly blocking me from disembarking. I broke from my stupor and realized I had maybe 5 seconds before the doors would slide shut, trapping me inside with him. I had to move. I tried to push past him, but the instant I made physical contact, he leaned down in one smooth, predatory motion, bringing his painted face inches from mine. Before he could get a grip on me, I shoved forward and burst past him onto the platform. And that's when he lunged. his arms outstretched as if to tackle me to the ground. I sidestepped his grasp and broke into a full sprint, and he immediately gave chase. The fear was absolutely paralyzing. The station was nearly deserted in the mid-afternoon lull, and I was utterly alone, being hunted by a clown. I risked a look over my shoulder and saw him still coming, but his run was wrong. It was a jerky, uncoordinated lope, as if his limbs weren't properly connected. But I was much more focused on what was now clutched in his hand. It looked like a large kitchen knife. I didn't know where he'd been concealing it or what his precise plans were, and I didn't care to find out. I flew up the stairs and out onto the bustling street, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. I immediately found a police officer and stammered out what had happened. The clown didn't follow me up to street level, but the damage was done. The police went down to check the station, but he was long gone by then. Even after being reassured by the officers that I was safe, I couldn't shake the irrational, gnawing fear that he somehow knew where I lived and would find me later. Of course, that never happened. In fact, the entire incident just faded away. I'm sure my story was just one line item in the long, strange list of clown encounters from that year. But it took me weeks to feel truly safe again, to stop glancing over my shoulder every time I stepped off a train. It makes you realize how quickly a mundane moment can curdle into a life-threatening situation.
And then there was the job. The one that seemed too good to be true. And of course, it was. This was after I'd finished my undergrad degree, during a period where I was floating between random gigs, trying to save some money. I spent a lot of time on job search websites. And one night, I found a listing that was peculiar. It was for a private lifeguard at a hotel a couple towns over. That part was normal. The details were not. First, the hours were inverted. They wanted someone to work the pool from 5 p.m. to 1 a.m. on weekdays. A night shift for a swimming pool. That was strange enough. But the second requirement was the real head-scratcher. They explicitly asked for someone who did not speak Spanish. Let me say that again. They specifically wanted a non-Spanish speaker. Here was my problem. I'm fluent. I grew up speaking it with my abuela. The town where the hotel was located had a large Spanish-speaking community too, so the request made zero logical sense. The whole listing was a bundle of contradictions. But there was one thing that overshadowed all the weirdness. The pay. $30 an hour. At that time in my life, it was a staggering amount of money. I made a decision. I would simply pretend I didn't understand a word of Spanish. What were they going to do? Test me? The job must have been new or deeply undesirable because I got a call for an interview within a day. I showed up at the hotel and everything looked standard. A friendly, round-faced guy named Esteban came out to greet me. He was amiable, cracking jokes, and it put me at ease. But as we walked toward the main office, another man, taller and leaner, rounded a corner and fixed me with an intense, appraising stare. I immediately felt like I was being sized up. The friendly guy felt like a deliberate tactic to lower my defenses. The tall man walked right up to me and began speaking in rapid, casual Spanish. No greeting, no handshake, nothing. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was testing me. I put on my best confused face, even though I understood he was just talking about the unseasonably warm weather. After a few moments, he stopped. I looked at Esteban, who looked at the tall man, and they both burst into laughter like it was all a big joke. The tall man finally smiled, shook my hand, and introduced himself as Jefe. He said he was just messing with me. I played along, but a deep sense of unease had already settled in my gut. He then led me on a tour to the pool area to explain the job. His explanation was that they wanted to boost revenue by allowing non-guests to use the pool for a fee during the evening hours. I didn't question the legality. I was too focused on the paycheck. He said they wanted a non-Spanish speaker to prevent quote-unquote rowdy locals from trying to argue or harass me, a justification that felt weak but that I accepted. My duties were straightforward. Lifeguard, collect entry fees, and call Jefe if there was any trouble. Then he added one final specific instruction. He told me that if anyone showed me a blue wristband, I was to let them into the pool house, a large separate building behind the lifeguard chair. I didn't ask what was inside. The first few weeks were deceptively calm.
More people used the pool than I anticipated, so I was busy taking money and watching the water. No one showed me a wristband. The first time it happened was about a month into the job. A muscular guy in sunglasses and a polo shirt walked up, didn't speak a word of English, and just flashed a blue band on his wrist. I unlocked the pool house door for him. About 45 minutes later, he came out and left. I noticed his backpack seemed bulkier than when he went in, but I dismissed it. Over the next month, more and more people with blue wristbands started showing up, often in small groups. Concurrently, the number of non-guests paying to swim skyrocketed, and they consistently overpaid, handing me large bills and telling me to keep the change. It was too much money, too consistently. I called Jefe about it once, and he brushed me off saying people are forgetful, and then hung up on me before I could say another word. That phone call was the moment the pieces clicked into my mind with a sickening finality. I was a prop. A carefully selected, clueless employee meant to lend an air of legitimacy to whatever was happening here. My mind kept circling back to one term: money laundering. The pool house was clearly the hub of the real operation. Gambling? Drugs? Something worse? I was terrified. Part of me screamed to quit immediately, to get as far away as possible, but another part, the part that loved the easy money, argued that my hands were clean. I was just a lifeguard. So I stayed. I kept my head down and did the job. The wristband wearers started getting familiar with me, learning my name, giving me friendly nods and high fives. As they grew more comfortable, they'd sometimes chat casually in Spanish near me, and the snippets of conversation I overheard only confirmed my darkest suspicions. The perks made it easier to ignore the truth. Then one afternoon, I actually had to do my job. A kid who couldn't swim had wandered into the deep end. I blew my whistle, dove in, and pulled him out. It wasn't a dramatic rescue, but the whole pool area erupted in applause. It felt strange and validating. Later, Jefe came down personally, shook my hand, and thanked me profusely, his eyes genuine with relief. I later realized the boy I'd saved was his son. The next day, Jefe, Esteban, and a group of the wristband guys were waiting for me with a bottle of expensive tequila for a toast. It felt good for a moment. Then one of the men, thinking I was still ignorant, made a toast in Spanish. I don't recall the exact words, but it was a vile celebration of the money they were making and the lives they were ruining to get it. Everyone laughed and drank. That was the moment the illusion shattered completely. The good feeling evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard dread. I was an accessory to something truly evil, bought off with tips and a steady paycheck. The final straw came a week later. My mother called me while I was on the stand. She only ever called for important reasons, so I had to answer. I climbed down and found a relatively private corner. My mother only speaks Spanish, so naturally our entire conversation was in Spanish. I don't even remember what it was about. What I do remember is hanging up, turning around, and finding Esteban standing right there. His earlier friendliness completely gone, replaced by a cold, hard stare. After a long, painful pause, he asked me how long I'd been able to speak Spanish. I stammered out a lie, saying I was just practicing with a friend and trying to learn. I knew he didn't believe a word of it. He just kept staring, his expression unreadable, and I felt in my soul that he was weighing options, and one of those options involved silencing me permanently. My heart felt like it was going to explode. Eventually, he just said, "Okay," turned and walked away. I forced myself back into the lifeguard chair, my entire body trembling. I debated running, but was terrified that would be the trigger. They knew where I lived. This felt like a test I was about to fail. Just before my shift ended, he came back. He told me to come in an hour earlier the next day, that he had a quote-unquote new opportunity for me. Then he handed me a folded stack of cash, several $100s, and walked off. When I drove away from that hotel that night, I never, ever went back. There was no way that situation had a happy ending for me. I wasn't followed home, as far as I could tell, but I lived in a state of high paranoia for months. Every strange car, every unexpected noise sent a jolt of terror through my body. Even now, years later, I can't fully explain all the details. They were clearly moving drugs or running some other illicit operation through that building. But why did they need me at all? My best guess is I was their clean face, the innocent employee they could point to if the police ever came snooping. Who knows? I am still convinced I was inches away from disappearing that day. The look in Esteban's eyes wasn't of anger. It was one of cold, calculated risk assessment. And I was a risk that had just become a liability. I traded my safety for a paycheck, and I almost paid the ultimate price. If these true stories sent a chill down your spine, please support the channel by liking this video and subscribing to Winds of Thought for more tales from the edge.